visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. We are here for you to get those questions answered. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us today in Germany, I think we're up to the G's now, then you'll want to dial 1-205-271-2985. And, of course, you can always send us an email. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery, our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Ace McKay is handling social media for us today. If you are listening to us via YouTube or Facebook, well, just put that question of yours in the comments box. Ace will see that. He'll say, aha, hark, gadzooks, and all that, and then he'll send it to us here in Studio One, and we'll hopefully get the job done for you. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well. You got your headphones now.
Yeah, I thought for a second we were going to have to do live radio call-in show without headphones.
Well, I'm going to have to take the hit for that because I borrowed those headphones when I was producing yesterday in the booth, but everything is back to normal now.
We've got the headphones back.
I have the most delightful question for you. This is from a 5-year-old.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. Tanner says, Dr. Anders, my 5-year-old daughter, Amelia, wanted to know if I could ask the podcast man, that's you, this question. After we're done being in heaven and Jesus gives us our bodies back, will we still have birthdays? Thank you, Tanner.
That is a great question.
It's awesome. From a 5-year-old.
That's a great question. So, we mark our birthdays by the sequence of the years, right?
Yes.
We know how the calendar works. The
yes.
Earth turns around the sun and so forth. I don't have a clue what the cosmology of the new heavens and the new earth will be. I don't know if we'll have a 365 and 1/4 day solar year. I don't know if we'll have seasons. I have no idea. I think it's entirely plausible that we'll have a calendar that you could mark off dates.
Yeah.
But perhaps we won't. I have no clue.
But she gets points for coming up with a great question.
Yeah, but maybe for a 5-year-old, the right answer would be every day will be a birthday celebration.
Oh, I like that a lot. Hey, thanks so much, Mom, for sending us that question. Here's one now from Stan in Springfield, Virginia. If Moses can said to be a typology for Jesus, what does Dr. Anders think of the following? The Exodus from Egypt might allegorically be seen as our birth or rebirth into Christianity, but then the wandering in the desert represents the many complexities of life, and our individual journeys can take 40 years or a lifetime and sometimes feel aimless, even despite God's grace and our prayers for faith and hope. Thanks, Stan in Springfield, Virginia.
Stan, I commend you for your analysis. Unfortunately, the fathers of the church beat you to it.
Okay.
Right? And so the Exodus has long been considered a kind of allegory of the Christian life. And if you want a really classic explication of that theme, please read St. Gregory of Nyssa. His Life of Moses does exactly what you just suggested. So it's an allegorical reading of Moses and the Exodus event as a metaphor, as an allegory for the Christian life.
Oh, very good. Stan in Springfield, Virginia, thanks so much for your question. Here's one now from Beth. Thanks for your show. I've learned a lot from listening. Can you help me to understand Matthew 17, specifically verses 10 through 13? From what I read, John the Baptist was the new Elijah. I don't understand this. Thanks in advance for your clarification, Beth.
Yeah, thank you. So, what Christ says about John the Baptist is that he came in the spirit and power of Elijah, and so he is the fulfillment of Malachi's prophecy that before the coming day of the Lord, the prophet Elijah would come. And what we know from Christ is that that does not mean the literal prophet Elijah, but someone in this sort of a type of an Elijah, which happens to have been John the Baptist.
Okay, very good. Beth, thanks so much for your question. Here's an interesting one from Tony. Any observations or comment on things I should keep in mind when reading The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's been a while. It's been a long time since I read The Problem of Pain. And so I'm going to have a little bit of trouble giving you some specifics. But generally speaking, I would like you to kind of back up and understand something about Lewis's worldview and how he thinks. Lewis is operating very much within the context of classic philosophical Christianity informed by classical philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and the like. And so he thinks in terms of rationality and human flourishing and eudaimonia, that is to say, what is the good kind of life for a human person to live. He thinks a lot about the intelligibility of the faith. But of course, what he's offering is a theodicy. He's offering an explanation for God and a justification of Christianity in light of the fact that humans suffer pain.
Okay. Well, very good. And thank you so much for that question. And we'll take this one right up to the break. This is from Madison. Dr. Anders, were the Cathars of the Middle Ages Christians? And do you have any books you could recommend about the Cathar movement?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So it all depends on your definition, right? Depends on your definition. If you consider the word Christian to mean someone who makes a conscious decision to follow Christ as they understand him to be, then by definition, anyone that proposes a religious way of life that's oriented in some fashion towards the name of Christ, we could broadly conceive of as Christian. But the Cathar religion was nothing like any kind of Christian orthodoxy or mainstream Christianity that you know. Is totally unlike Catholicism, totally unlike Orthodoxy, and while there are some superficial similarities to elements of Protestantism, it's very unlike Protestantism. There is a social history of the Cathar movement called Montayu. I'll give you the full title after the break.
Sounds good. So sit tight. We'll continue on that on the other side of the break. We'll also talk with Leslie in North Texas and hopefully you as well at 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion on EWTN.
Tomorrow morning on the Sunrise Morning Show.
We'll kick off the annual Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. We'll also talk Bible foods with Rita Heichenfeld from About Eating and get thoughts from pastoral counselor Kevin Prendergast on how to manage your relationship with alcohol. Plus all the latest news, weather, sports, and everything you need to start your day.
The Sunrise Morning Show, tomorrow at 6 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
He was a scholar, a preacher, a Capuchin Franciscan, and a defender of Christendom.
Matthew Bunsen and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Lawrence of Brindisi was one of the most respected preachers in the 17th century, but he also helped raise an army against the Ottoman Turks when they invaded Hungary in 1601. He led the troops to victory against the Turks, carrying only a crucifix. He was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1959.
To find out more about the Doctors of the Church, visit EWTN.com and click on Catholicism.
Communities in Southern California gather to celebrate the beauty and dignity of every human life. EWTN takes you to San Francisco for live coverage of the Walk for Life West Coast, Saturday, January 20th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Then, don't miss inspiring speakers and music during One Life LA at 5 p.m. Eastern. The pro-life festivities begin Saturday, January 20th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern on EWTN TV and radio.
It's Called to Communion on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or perhaps just tell us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic, In any event, the phone number is the same, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. So before the break, we were answering a question from Madison, who said, we're the Cathars of the Middle Ages Christians, and do you have any books you could recommend about the Cathar movement? During the break, I mentioned to David, I said, I've never heard of the Cathars, but then he said, oh, it's the Albigensians. Now, them I've heard of.
Yes, so before the break, I said the Cathars or the Albigensians were Christians only in the broadest sense of the term, in that they acknowledge the person of Jesus having something to do with their religious belief system. But in terms of having any kind of alliance with Orthodox, conciliar, confessional Christianity, whether Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, you name it, they'd be way outside the mainstream. If you had a Cathar community today, we would clearly consider them a cult or a sect and not, sort of part of the mainstream Christian movement. In terms of books about Catharism or Albigensianism, probably the classic work here, and I love this guy's name. His name is a mouthful to say. It's a French scholar from the Annales school, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and that's Leroy-Ladurie. Emmanuel Leroy. See, I'm going to get tongue-tied doing it. Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie is his name, all right? And the title of the book has been translated into English and published under two different titles. One of them is Montaillou, and that's Montaillou, Montaillou, The Promised Land of Error. And the other one is Montaillou, Cathars and Catholics in a French Village, 1294 to 1324. And what this book is it's a social history, an oral history of what daily life and faith was like for the people in this Cathar community in 13th and early 14th century France.
Fascinating.
It was a famous book. It sold over 250,000 copies when it came out. And most sort of academic tomes on social history, they're not bestseller type books, but this one really had a smash hit.
How about that? Madison, thanks so much for your email. If you'd like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. I'll give you that phone number one more time, and that is 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. We'll get to the phones in just a second here. Brand new book now available from EWTN Publishing, Standing Strong, Good Discipline Makes Great Teens by Dr. Ray Guarendi. Dr. Ray gives parents the tools they need not only to navigate the teen years, but also to enjoy them by unpacking issues ranging from sibling relationships, peer pressure, curfews, chores, to overcoming back talk, teaching your kids to avoid drugs. This book has got it all. Imagine this: 3 techniques for becoming a calmer parent. Turn that temperature down a little bit. And what about this one? 5 ways to monitor your child's use of technology. And it's only going to get more complicated as we continue on. Again, the book, Standing Strong, Good Discipline Makes Great Teens by Dr. Ray Guarendi. It's available right now from EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic, EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Leslie in North Texas, listening on the Great Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Leslie, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. Hello, Tom.
Hi there.
Indulgences. I don't know anything about them except a little bit from Middle Age history about indulgences and Luther's objections to them, and also enough to know there has been scandal associated with them. And I'm in RCIA, and I wouldn't let that stop me from becoming Catholic, but can you give me some light about the history and the foundation and the current state with indulgences?
Sure, absolutely. Nothing I'd rather do. I really appreciate the question. So the practice of indulgences began in the Catholic Church in the middle of the 3rd century, around the year 250. And it was something that was born spontaneously in the heart of the Christian faithful. It was not something that was proposed or imposed by the Catholic hierarchy. And so the caricature of indulgences is this is something that the hierarchy used to fleece the laity. In fact, they came into existence in almost the opposite way. And let me explain how that was. So in Christian antiquity, the practice of confession and absolution, penance, the sacrament of penance, was not celebrated privately the way it is today. You didn't go in a box and close the door and whisper your confession privately in the priest's ear. The absolution of sins was granted in a public context, and the penance that penitents did was also very public. And typically, the sacrament was only, one had recourse to the sacrament for only sort of very gross public and scandalous sins. Classically, murder, adultery, and apostasy would have been sort of live contenders for invoking the sacrament of penance and absolution. But when penances were imposed, they were typically things like having to sit at the back of the church and refrain from Holy Communion for a lengthy period of time, perhaps even years.
Wow.
And the penances were so long that the Council of Nicaea in 325, when it published its canons, reminded bishops that they had to readmit penitents to Holy Communion before they died, right? They have to be able to have viaticum. So you can't impose a penance that lasts until their death, which means that some people were doing that. They were really kicking them out for a long time. And so in the 250s, there was a persecution of the church, particularly in North Africa, under the Roman Emperor Decius. This is called the Decius. It was the Decian persecution. And as in most persecutions, there were a number of people who were martyred. Some were imprisoned. And some, of course, gave it all up under persecution and renounced the faith under threat of torture or imprisonment. The ones that were imprisoned, not killed, but had held on to the faith, were known as confessors rather than martyrs. And many times they continued to languish in Roman prisons, in North African prisons. The folks that apostatized would be kicked out of the church for this grave sin of apostasy and admitted only on condition of performing a lengthy penance. Now, while they were sitting there performing their penances, some of these people that were subject to the church's discipline got the idea, we got these confessors over here that are in Roman prisons, they're in state prisons, and they're just, languishing away and acquiring all kinds of merit because they've testified to Christ, and we admire them, and they're, yay, go them. I wonder if the bishop would be willing to swap out some of their merit for my demerit and cut the time off of my penance. And so they would go visit the souls in prison. They would go visit the confessors in prison and say, would you write a writ of indulgence telling the bishop that you would be willing to substitute the penance that you're doing, that was imposed by the state for confessing Christ, on my behalf, so he'll cut down on my penance? And many of the confessors did that. They would write a document and say, I don't know, Caesarius, hereby substitute, this much time of my penance on behalf of, Tom over here who's doing penance, and then take that to the bishop. The bishop in Carthage at the time was Cyprian, Bishop St. Cyprian of Carthage, and he saw this and he said, you know what? Actually, the logic of this works, because within the Catholic Church we have this doctrine that we all bear one another's burdens. St. Paul said in Colossians, I fill up on my own flesh what's lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church, as if the sufferings of Paul somehow could avail for the salvation of others. And he says, well, that's actually good theology. The only problem is that the jurisdiction, the decision here, needs to lie with the bishop, not with the penitent and the confessors themselves. But the idea that the church could appeal to the merits of the martyrs, the merits of the saints, the merits of the suffering on behalf of sinners makes sense. And you ought to have some token of repentance, to qualify for this. And so, here say a prayer, here go do a good work or whatnot. And so they would attach some pious practice to it, and in virtue of that, they would cut down the temporal punishment that was due to sin. Well, two developments happened in the practice of indulgences in the Middle Ages. One was that, if the logic works for temporal penances imposed by the church, does it also count for temporal penances imposed by God? And of course, the way that God imposes temporal penances is through purgatory. That's one of the ways that he does it. So could you apply the merits of the saints on behalf of the souls in purgatory? And again, the logic is sound. It's a biblical logic. So the church said, well, yeah. And here's the other development. One of the things, and this is where the abuses came in, one of the good works that is constantly exhorted in sacred scripture, and as a good work that can atone for sin, is giving alms. I mean, Tobit says that explicitly. If you give alms, you will atone for sin. And so, okay, go say these prayers, do this pious work, or give alms to the poor. And, well, that's fine. But then, someone in the church got the great idea, well, if you're going to give alms to the poor, could you give alms to the church? And then that's, of course, where the corruption came out.
Sure,
right?
sure.
And so that eventually got out of hand, and reformers before Luther said, we got to stop this giving alms business as a penance because it's being exploited by the hierarchy or unscrupulous priests. And so they did put it into it. But the underlying logic of indulgences has nothing to do with manipulation of the laity by the clergy. That was a medieval development, late medieval development that was an abuse. It has to do with this spontaneous awareness that we bear one another's burdens in the church and that the righteous can pray and intercede and merit on behalf of the less righteous, which is a biblical principle that exists from Genesis to Revelation.
Yeah. Leslie, is that helpful for you?
Very.
Good.
And so now when they say, hey, you get an indulgence for doing, I can't remember, the church has said a few in the past year or two that I've been doing RCIA. What is that saying?
So what that is if you perform the pious good work that's asked of you, the church is appealing to God through the merits of the saints on your behalf that whatever temporal punishment is due to sin in your case would be remitted or reduced. Now, what we can't do is assign some kind of mathematical proportionality with absolute certainty that says, okay, if Leslie does, this prayer, we can guarantee that she'll get, 9 months off of purgatory. We can't do that. And some indulgences have a length of time assigned to them, but it should not be understood as a length of time off in purgatory. The origin of that was from the actual penances imposed by the church. If the church had said you have to do penance for, a year and a half, but if you do this indulgence, we'll cut that down by 9 months. Mm-hmm. That's where those terms come from, right? But today, we've had serious indulgence inflation, over the centuries. And so now it's so easy to get a plenary indulgence, which is the remission of all temporal punishment due to sin, that people are like, what do I want a 9-month indulgence for? I can go get me a plenary indulgence for praying the rosary, so I'm not going to mess with these minor indulgences. But that's what it is. Now, if you perform the good work in expectation of a plenary indulgence, one of the conditions for receiving the full remission of all temporal punishment due to sin is that we have no attachment to sin. And of course, that is an interior disposition that one has to have. Yeah. That's very difficult or impossible to gauge in one's own case. It means God has to be the judge of that. So we can't ever know for sure that one has received the full benefit of an indulgence, but one does definitely receive a benefit. And I have acquired indulgences. I will continue to do so in the future. My two favorite indulgences that I ever acquired.
Yes.
I visited Assisi, the home of St. Francis.
Yeah.
And there was a plenary indulgence offered for visiting one of the shrines, I think. And so I did that, and I wanted it to be applied on behalf of the soul of the father of a friend of mine. And I remember I wrote him and said, no, I've got this plenary indulgence that we're going to get that for your dad who just passed. And
wow.
He said that was so meaningful to him, knowing that I was there in Assisi. He really appreciated it.
Beautiful.
The other one was during the Year of Faith. Pope Benedict granted a plenary indulgence to anyone that would visit the place of their baptism. I was baptized in a Presbyterian church that later converted to a kind of non-denominational Baptist church where the idea of gaining an indulgence was, let us say, would not have been well received, okay? But I said, by golly, I'm going to get this indulgence, right? So I went to, I'll just go ahead and tell you, it was Mountain Brook Community Church that had previously been Broadwood Presbyterian Church,
wow.
PCA,
Wow.
And I wander into the sanctuary, sit down right at the site of my baptism, and I'm sitting there making my pious prayers, and somebody says, what are you doing here? And I said, well, you wouldn't believe it if I told you.
That is fantastic. Leslie, thanks so much for your call. We hope that your RCA journey is very fruitful. Hey, that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN. Jeannie's driving through Louisiana, listening to us on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Jeannie, what's on your mind today?
Yes, hello. Hi, Dr. Anders. So I have a question about the book of Revelation. I just finished up with the Bible in a Year with Father Mike. And in chapter 2, it brings up a couple of times of a group called the Nicolaitans. So in chapter 2, where he's talking to the church in Ephesus, he's commending them on one hand, but then he does say that, yet this you have, in verse 6, you hate the work of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And then in speaking to the church in Pergamum, verse 15 of chapter 2, says, so you also have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent then. So maybe could you explain who this group was and what they taught and what their works were?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So we don't really know. We don't really know who the Nicolaitans were, but there is some speculation that they were an early antinomian group. Antinomianism is the doctrine that you do not have to adhere to any law in your Christian life. So it's a kind of, radical immoralist position. And so there's some speculation they may have been antinomian.
Jeannie, thanks so much for your call. In a moment, we'll talk with Sarah from St. Petersburg, Florida. A couple lines open for you. Grab one at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
This is Father Joseph Mary. On Mother Angelica Answering the Call, we'll bring you viewer phone calls and Mother's Great Responses. Sunday afternoon, 2 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
How should we pray? The disciples asked our Lord that question, and he gave them the Our Father, or the Lord's Prayer. But he also gave them the liturgy, which is the most privileged form of prayer in the Catholic tradition, especially the holy sacrifice of the Mass. We can pray with the whole Church in the liturgy of the hours or the divine office, and we should also pray in our own private room, our secret chamber, as Jesus says, and then our Father who sees us in secret will reward us.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
Most of us are acquainted with the problem of homelessness, but have you given much thought about homeless pregnant women? Where do they go for protection from the elements? How do they find and receive medical care? Where can they go to live safely? Cradle of Hope, a pro-life pregnancy center in Iowa, began to encounter women who were couch surfing, that is, sleeping on couches, going from friend to friend. Other women were living in their cars. The center researched for and found a place where homeless women can go for help during pregnancy and beyond. And it's open to women from every state. The Lord will say to these people, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.
For more information, visit our website at lifeissues.org and stay informed, more informed than you've ever been.
This is EWTN, Catholic Radio.
When was a time you were stubborn and later wished you hadn't been?
Join us tomorrow on Take 2 with Jerry and Debbie on most of these EWTN stations.
Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. If you call right now, we can hopefully get you on today's program, 833-288-3986. All right, let's go to Sarah, a first-time caller from St. Petersburg, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hi, Sarah. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. I was wondering if you could help me understand the difference between Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic, and can they receive the sacraments in our church, and can we in theirs?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the biggest difference between Greek Orthodoxy and Catholicism, the biggest difference, is that the Greek Orthodox reject the universal jurisdiction of the Pope. Right. So the Catholic belief is that the Bishop of Rome is also the Vicar of Christ on earth and that he has universal jurisdiction over the entire Christian world. The Orthodox typically admit that the Bishop of Rome has a kind of primacy historically, that he is sort of the best, tallest, highest, most eminent bishop in the world. And they acknowledge that in antiquity he had an important role to play, particularly in adjudicating disputes. When something would be, brought to the papacy as a kind of court of final appeal, they will acknowledge that. But they would deny that he had a kind of independent jurisdiction over the whole world. So if somebody didn't appeal a case to Rome, the Orthodox would hold the position that Rome had no business intervening, right? So they want an independence from papacy in that regard. That's the biggest difference. There are some others. The Catholic Church has a fairly robust doctrine of the afterlife, right? That includes the doctrine of purgatory. The Orthodox Church definitely believes that there is an afterlife in which prayers for the dead can be efficacious. So they do pray for the dead, but they're less specific on precisely what happens there, and so they don't like the definition of the dogma of purgatory as such. We both admit that Mary does not have any sin, that she's all holy and all pure, and that she's the Theotokos, the Mother of God, who prays and intercedes for the Church. But the Orthodox don't like to talk about that doctrine in terms of an immaculate conception. So the Catholic belief is that Mary was preserved from every stain of original sin. Orthodox don't believe in original sin. They don't have a doctrine of original sin as such. And so to describe Mary's purity in those terms is kind of outside of their theological wheelhouse. And there's some other differences. Differences in the way we celebrate Holy Communion. In the Middle Ages, they even got bent out of shape about the fact that Latin priests would shave. So I mean, but the big one, yeah. And then of course I have to mention the Filioque, which is the article in the Creed that states that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And for historical reasons, the Orthodox got pretty upset about the phrase "and the Son" being inserted into the Creed, particularly in that it happened outside of an ecumenical council. So, but the big one, again, is the differences over the jurisdiction of the Pope. And most of the other differences see, we have Eastern Rite Catholics. We have Catholics that celebrate the liturgy just like the Orthodox do, using the very same words. The liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Catholics in the East will do that. We have Catholics whose theological patrimony is much more aligned to Orthodoxy in the way they would express themselves. We have Catholics in the East that don't say the Filioque when they say the Creed. So like if you superficially what's the word I'm looking for? Cosmetically, if you will, that's the word. If you were to walk into an Eastern Rite Catholic church, you might not at first recognize that it was Catholic as opposed to Orthodox, because there'd be so many sort of visual similarities and gestures and ritual similarities. What really boils down to where the rubber hits the road is this question of the Pope. Now, can the Orthodox receive communion in the Catholic Church and vice versa? That's interesting. There's an asymmetrical relationship here. So the Catholic Church does say that Orthodox can receive sacraments in the Catholic Church with some caveats, but yes, they can with some caveats. But the Orthodox don't return the favor. So if a Catholic presented himself for communion in an Orthodox church, he would be sent away. Now, interestingly, the Catholic Church also tells the Catholic faithful, don't go present yourself for communion in an Orthodox church because they're not in communion. And see, communion is a witness to the Catholicity of the church, to the unity of the church. And by going to communion, I'm saying this is the church that Christ founded. This is where I want to plant my flag, so to speak. That helps explain why Catholics would permit Orthodox to come to communion, because, see, we see them as very, very close cousins, pretty much the same church that just kind of fell into a dispute in the 11th century. And so when Orthodox people come to communion in a Catholic church, they're just expressing that Catholic unity that we think already exists.
Yeah.
But to justify that split, the Orthodox have to make the case that Latins are wrong about a lot of things. Hence, well, you can't come to communion in our church.
Fascinating. Wow. There you go, Sarah. Hope that's helpful for you. Thanks so much for your call today from St. Petersburg. Call to communion on EWTN. Couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Kimberly's watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Kimberly says, can Dr. Anders speak on the Waldensians? I've heard them referred to as early Anabaptists. From what I've read on their beliefs, they do seem in agreement with Baptists today. Is this the case?
No, not the case. It depends. If you talk about contemporary Waldensians, they are different from the medieval Waldensians. All right. And now, if you were to walk into, say, the Waldensian church in Rome, and there is one today, right? You would find something that looked a lot more like Protestantism today. Waldensianism as a movement was influenced by the Protestant Reformation. But if you look at the original Waldensians for their first, say, 300-year history, from the end of the 12th century up to the Reformation, their beliefs would not have aligned with mainstream Protestantism. In particular, there's no evidence that the Waldensians ever accepted the Lutheran doctrine of justification by faith alone until Luther taught it to them. So the classic Waldensian doctrine of salvation would have been much more moralistic than Luther would have allowed for. Peter Waldo was a wealthy merchant in Lyon, in France, at the end of the 12th century, who advocated apostolic poverty and lay preaching. And at first, the church didn't quite know what to do with the Waldensians, but when they began to emphasize the preaching of and teaching of laity as opposed to priests, the church woke up and took notice and subjected some Waldensians to theological examination to see if they were competent to present the doctrine of the church, and they weren't. They failed rather miserably, and so the Pope said, well, sorry, you can live apostolic poverty all day long, but you can't preach. At that point, the Waldensians said, well, that's more important to us than unity with the church, and they broke away and became a heretical sect.
Wow.
Right? And many of them were reconciled to the church throughout the centuries. But that's the origin of the thing. Now, that movement to apostolic poverty and sort of radical way of life as a contradiction to the growing money economy in Europe in the 12th century and the corruption of the clergy and the hierarchy was not something that was limited to the Waldensian movement. In fact, the most famous proponents of that way of life were, in fact, Catholics. Francis of Assisi was an almost exact contemporary of Peter Waldo. He advocated almost the exact same thing, which is why when Innocent III first learned about Francis of Assisi, he said, oh boy, I've seen this before. And his initial inclination was to disallow, not to approve the Franciscan way of life, because he said, well, this is just Waldensianism all over again. And then Francis proved, and supposedly God indicated to Innocent through a dream that Francis was not Peter Waldo, but was in fact the means that God was going to use to reform the church in the late Middle Ages. And so Innocent III, in a brilliant strategic move, following the lifelong principle of the age-old principle is if you can't beat them, join them, said, well, we're gonna baptize this apostolic poverty movement and turn it into something the church can benefit from. And thus were born the Franciscan Reform, and then the Dominican Reform, and then all the mendicant orders that came into existence.
Wow.
There is a great book, two good books on this period of history and the social situation. One is by Lester Little, and it's called The Poverty Movement of the Middle Ages, and it's about this move to apostolic poverty. The other one is by Herbert Grundmann, and the title of the book is The Religious Movement of the Middle Ages, and it deals with the Waldensians and the Franciscans and many other heretical groups all sort of popped up at this time and advocated more or less radical visions of reform, all of which preceded Luther by 300 years.
Fascinating, really is. Kimberly, thanks so much for your question today via YouTube. Glad that you're watching us. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Last call for your call, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here's an email from Wallace in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I'm hoping you can help me with something. I grew up accustomed to hearing evangelical Protestants saying things like, quote, we suffer because we deserve it, and hell is our default destination. Well, I never found this viewpoint to square with Catholic teaching, yet lately I've encountered Catholics saying the same thing, and it strikes me as the result of poor catechesis. My understanding of the catechism of the Catholic Church is that for damnation to even be possible, one has to willfully turn away from God and persist in such a state. Essentially, God wishes that all should be saved and gives us the means to do that by becoming partakers of the divine nature through Christ. Now, I understand that we have a broken, fallen nature and have a propensity to do bad things, but to imply that we're inherently evil and deserving of eternal torment almost seems like an insult to a God who is love. Am I off the mark here? Thanks for all you do. Wallace in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
Yeah, thanks. So you're onto something, and what's at stake here are two divergent understandings of original sin.
Okay.
And the classic Protestant position on original sin, and there are exceptions to this, but I'm thinking here of your Lutherans and your Calvinists and your classical Anglicans, is that original sin is conceived of as a kind of infection that pervades the soul and makes the soul to be intrinsically hateful to God. So just in virtue of being alive, the soul infected by this disease called original sin merits God's wrath. There was a Puritan preacher, might have been Thomas Hooker. I remember reading this decades ago, and I forgotten the source, but I think it might be the Puritan preacher Thomas Hooker, who said if we dropped from our mother's womb into hell and were there roaring, it would be just.
Wow.
And Jonathan Edwards echoes this sentiment in The Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God when he says that as vile and loathsome is the most loathsome serpent in your eyes, so are you to God.
Ooh.
Right? And it's that idea that original sin is a kind of corruption of our very nature that makes us intrinsically hateful to God, that it is in fact imputable to the individual soul as guilt. Even though one has no personal agency in original sin, it has the character of actual sin in one's life. And it pervades everything you do, right? That's the other aspect of the classic Protestant view, is that original sin is like ink dispersed through a glass of water. Even a drop renders the whole thing black and impenetrable. So original sin pervades the soul and every part of it, so that everything you do, even Mother Teresa pulling dying people off the streets of Calcutta, is intrinsically hateful to God in virtue of having been performed by this execrable sinner. That's the classic Protestant view. The Catholic view is very different. The Catholic view is that original sin is not a kind of infection pervading the soul and everything in it, making it intrinsically hateful to God. It is a privation. It's the lack of something. It's not an infection in the soul. It's the absence of sanctifying grace. And it's not imputable to the soul as personal guilt. It's not actual sin. So God doesn't look at the soul and say, you have original sin on your soul, yuck, I hate you. He doesn't do that, right? Now, it's accompanied by wounds that make virtue difficult for us, all but impossible apart from grace, but does not intrinsically merit damnation. All right, so that's the difference. That's the difference. Now, as far as our actual state is concerned, the Catholic position would be that in our state of actual sin, because we've chosen to say we do deserve hell, and that judgment would be just against us. But of course, God has provided a remedy and offered grace sufficient to salvation to every man, woman, and child that will ever be born.
All right. Thanks so much, and appreciate your question today here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Hey, this weekend, be sure to join us for The Miracle Hunter with Michael O'Neill. Always a fascinating program as Michael delves into the mysteries of the Catholic faith. There's a lot to unpack each and every week. You can check it out Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern and again at 7 p.m. Eastern Time only on EWTN Radio. It's The Miracle Hunter with Michael O'Neill, a fantastic program. A question from John, not too far away from us, Cullman, Alabama. John says, is there a proper rubric for the Novus Ordo Mass for the priest to always face the parishioners, or can he face the tabernacle? Thanks. Love your show. Best regards, John and Cullman.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the question of liturgical law, not my specialty. Not my specialty.
Got it.
I don't think... But again, like I don't say Mass, so I don't have to familiarize myself with all the rubrics for the priest in the general instruction for the Roman Missal. But I think there's nothing in the Missal itself that would prevent celebrating the liturgy ad orientem. Now, there can be specific instruction from the bishop that says, we're not going to do that in our diocese.
Yeah.
Right. And so generally speaking, priests who celebrate the new order of the Mass don't celebrate it ad orientem. And I think the Holy See now says you can't do that. I'm not sure about that. I'm pretty sure they say that you can't, but it's not. I don't know that it's in the germ itself. It's been accompanying instructions. But, you priests that listen, who do this and are sort of bound up in the germ. Germ is the abbreviation for general instruction of the Roman Missal. Let me know, but I'm pretty sure there's nothing in the Missal itself that says you can't, but you can't.
There you go. Appreciate that, John. We hope that's helpful for you. Thanks for listening to us in Cullman. Here's one now from Donna in Miami. According to a book called Religions in America, it clearly states that the Unitarian sect denies the doctrine or dogma of the virgin birth. Can you explain why? I'd like to know. Thanks, Donna in Miami.
Yeah, right. Well, so most contemporary Unitarians would, of course, deny the doctrine of the divinity of Christ. I mean, that's really the biggie there, and they, of course, deny the doctrine of the Trinity. So the virgin birth is kind of downstream from those. Right? If you're going to deny the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, I mean, what do you need a virgin birth for?
Oh, well, yeah.
I mean, that's really almost trivial in comparison. Not trivial, but I mean, it's definitely lower down the hierarchy of truths. As a practical matter, most modern Unitarians would be distinctly non-supernaturalist in their understanding of the Christian faith or religion, and more or less reducible to a kind of benign humanism.
Okay. Appreciate that, and thanks so much for your email. Here's one from Kenny from Gonzales, Louisiana. He says, I'm a cradle Catholic. My brother left the Catholic Church some 20 years ago. We were having breakfast the other morning, and I said grace before the meal. Then I noticed he did not make the sign of the cross. I asked him why he doesn't make the sign of the cross. He was shocked and recoiled, saying that's his preference or whatever. I'm 62, he's 63. He now says he's non-denominational. Could you elaborate a little more on the origin of the sign of the cross? Thanks, Kenny.
Thanks, Kenny. So our earliest reference to the sign of the cross in history is in the early Christian writer Tertullian, who writes in the 2nd century and mentions that it is a practice that he has of apostolic origin. So he makes the assertion that it comes from the apostles. Did it come from the apostles? We don't know. I mean, Tertullian said that it did. We have one early witness claiming it's of apostolic origin. It was clearly very early, and it was something that Tertullian received from tradition. He didn't make it up. But of course, that's it. That's the extent of our testimony.
Yeah.
We know from other liturgical manuals and so forth that it is very widespread and very, very early, and even 2nd century witnesses received it as something that they believed to be apostolic in its origin. So very, very, very early, very, very early. That's about all we know. Now, obviously, the significance of it is, God speaks sign language. Basically, we can make a gesture with our body that invokes the Blessed Trinity, and what a good thing that is.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally love the sign of the cross. It's probably, it is a prayer. It is a prayer by way of gesture, and I'd say it might be the prayer that I pray the most. I make it all the time.
I love it too, and I really enjoy doing that prayer as my wife, Adrienne, does, in a public setting, like a restaurant. Just,
sure.
Get out there and be that Catholic.
You know who I'm talking about. I have a friend, you have him too, who's a church musician.
Oh, yes.
And he became Catholic years and years ago, but musicians have to get work where they can find it.
Sure.
He was playing music in a non-Catholic church, and at a reverent moment in their liturgy, he made the sign of the cross, just kind of out of a habit as a Catholic.
Yeah.
And he said, a parishioner came up to him afterwards and said, "That was so beautiful. Do that again." And what is that you're doing? Oh, that's cool. I like that. Let me see more of that.
That is awesome. Cal is watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Cal says, "Can Dr. Anders please address cultural Catholics, who I know so many of, meaning the people who attend church, go through the motions, and yet often they don't themselves believe in the supernatural and even God. Can you address cultural Catholics?"
Hello, cultural Catholics. I'm addressing you. No,
Thank you.
That's not what you meant. Right, exactly. Oh, sure, there's lots of these, of course, to be sure. And the New Testament speaks about people that have the form of religion and deny its power, right?
Yeah.
So it's something that's been in religious practice for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. And you'll find that every religious tradition, Catholic, non-Catholic, Christian, non-Christian, has this division into people that are serious adherents and those that are nominal adherents only. That's a sort of common sociological phenomenon. And I don't think it's that hard to understand why. I mean, if you're brought up within the church in a form of practice where you are taught, you're conditioned to not take it seriously as divine revelation and supernatural salvation, well, then that's what you're going to be habituated to, right? And it takes confrontation, I find, with an extraordinary personality to present the faith to you as livable. Mm-hmm. And for many people, their experience of the Christian faith, Catholic or not, is just nominal, and then they have an encounter. They have an encounter with some individual in whom Christ is a living power that really animates and directs their lives. And if that person's life is overcoming, is compelling, then the nominal believer says, well, that's a point of view I never had before.
Yeah.
How interesting is that? And, of course, existential crises and life transitions can prompt deeper questions of, who am I, what's the meaning of my life, and what does God have to do with it? I mean, I remember I was not nominal by any stretch of the imagination, but I was not good, when I was growing up as a kid. I mean, religion was very much a part of our identity as a family, and I consider myself a deeply religious person, but I was a pretty lousy fellow, lacking virtue and carrying on sort of the wild life. When I got to college, I remember the question, this again? Like, I'd done all the wild crazy in high school, and here was just more wild and crazy. I thought, there's got to be more to my existence than just, drinking booze and chasing girls. And I thought, well, maybe Jesus has something to do with that, Before he'd been sort of to me like gravity, something that I believed in but sort of took for granted as the furniture of the universe, but not something that was going to be a living presence in my daily decision-making. And that prompted me to a deeper investigation that led me ultimately into the Catholic Church.
And we couldn't be happier. I remember very quickly here, when we lived in Los Angeles, we had our son was very young. We were looking around for a babysitter, somebody that we could trust. A fellow recommended this one woman. Her name was Tilly. And when we went to her home to talk with her, here's a statue here and a rosary there. And, we left thinking, well, she's very nice, but she really takes this Catholic jazz really far.
Takes that really seriously, yeah.
But that was the first step in our own conversion within the faith.
There you go.
Fantastic. And we still pray for Tilly every day. Here's a quick email from Uriah. He says, I wanted to start by expressing my deep gratitude for your ministry, which was directly responsible for my entrance into the church and the beginnings of a life reformed by Christ. Thank you. I'm familiar with the acts of penance performed by priests and monks by the request of lay faithful that lead to the concept of indulgences. My question is, are we, as lay Catholics, able to request additional penance from a priest on behalf of loved ones, both living or deceased? Respectfully, Uriah.
Yeah, so that's not a common Catholic practice, and if your desire is to do penance on behalf of another person, you don't really need to ask the priest's permission to do it or to have him assign that to you. You could, in spiritual direction, you could. And it's useful to. You're going to make major decisions in your spiritual life to submit them to the judgment of somebody else, like a spiritual director. But you don't have to. You could fast from lunch, for example, and offer that fast for someone else's intention. That's you don't have to have a priest tell you to do that. And if it's a matter of obtaining an indulgence, an actual indulgence, well, the church, there's a book of indulgences that tells you literally here are all the things you can do in the Catholic Church to gain an indulgence and apply to somebody else. So you don't need to make one up yourself.
There you go. Uriah, thanks for your email and for your kind words about the show. We'll close with this one from Dick in Dover, Ohio. If I want to ask a favor of God, is it a necessity to complete my question with the words, in Jesus' name?
Nope.
Don't have to do that.
Nope. Prayer is not magic. It's not, in magic, in classical superstitious magic, there's some precise rite or formula that one pronounces, according to some strict rubric and usually some arcane language, expelliarmus, whatever it might be. And if you, wave your wand the right way and pronounce the word with the right intention, Wingardium Leviosa from Harry Potter, then you get the desired effect. Prayer is not like that at all. Prayer is relationship. It's like asking the question, if I want my mother to give me an extra slice of pizza, do I have to use the right intonation and the right... Well, my mother probably, actually. But, with many people's mothers, for my mother, it always had to be grammatically correct. Everything else was variable, but if I used bad grammar, I was going to be corrected.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
All right, and thank you so much for that question. A lot of questions we answered today, primarily email, but an awful lot of phone calls as well, and even some questions via YouTube and Facebook. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday right here on EWTN Radio at 2 p.m. Eastern each and every weekday. You can check out the podcast by going to EWTN.com, click on radio, and then once you're on the radio homepage, then you want to look for the words Podcast Central. Click on that, scroll down to Call to Communion, and you are off to the races. On behalf of our fantastic team today, Charles, Matt, and Ace, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Hey, thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow on the Thursday edition of Call to Communion. Until then, have a wonderful day and stay warm, by the way. God bless.
Hi, I'm Debbie Georgiani. Adam Bly and I invite you to join us as we tackle the spirit world on EWTN Radio. Adam has assisted at thousands of solemn exorcisms and resolutions of hauntings. He also reaches out to educate people on the paranormal and the occult in our culture. Join us Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern for the Spirit World on EWTN Radio.